It's been 10 years since China raised the concept of building a community with a shared future for mankind. And this idea aims to answer the most fundamental question between conflicts and peace, division and unity, chaos and order. Where should we be heading?
That's right. The challenge the world is facing today show that building a community with a shared future for mankind is more than a political solution proposed by China. It's a vision and a wisdom the country offers in a time when only joint efforts can make real differences. And this is CGTN's special forum, Our World. And today we're talking about how this concept was created, how it's developed, and its significance in addressing global crisis. I'm Zhao.
And I'm Dongning. And for our discussion today, we're now very pleased to be joined in the studio by Mr. Xia Lu, an associate professor from the School of Marxism Studies at Renmin University of China, and Mr. Liu Baocheng, the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics, and Mr. David Ferguson, a senior translation editor from Foreign Language Press of China International Publishing Group, and Mr. Einar Tangen, the independent political and economic commentator. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us in the studio today.
And also joining us online, our former Ethiopian ambassador to China, Teshome Toga Chanaka, Professor Zha Daojiong from the School of International Studies at Peking University, and Joseph Olivier Mendo'o, the African Youth Delegation in China. Welcome to Our World.
Well, building a community with shared future for mankind actually is China's worldview and has been written into UN resolutions. But despite this idea of China working with the rest of the world to achieve something better, the West still firmly believes China is a threat. It is a threat that would challenge the international current order and imposing threats to other nations. So, Professor Xia, I will start with you on this matter. What is the logic and the value behind the idea of China threat?
Thanks very much for the question. Actually, this is very important, and we have recently done a project, a research project on how does the Western people view China, or how has the Chinese image changed through all this kind of reform period. We have noticed that in the early stage of China's reform in the 1980s, actually, it was not a China threat thesis yet. It was kind of a skepticism of China, because all the Western kind of powers and the countries and even the companies, they were skeptical of China, about whether China can, successfully, do the reform or kind of boom the economy. So the first stage is China skeptical of China, and the second stage, actually, in 1990s, it was not yet the threat, but it's the China kind of collapse. The collapse of China, because follow the 1980s and 1990s, all the old foreign the communist regime kind of broken down. So they would argue that for the near future, China will follow this path. However, well, China didn't collapse, right? And then it was the thesis about China's threat, because nowadays we have been noticed that China is getting stronger and stronger. So China becomes a threat in these three reasons. First one, China is very kind of a huge country with a population of more than 1.4 billion. So never happened before. 1.4 billion people got risen up or got kind of prosperity and got kind of stronger and stronger. So that's the first reason. Second reason, that China is a very kind of a big country and more than kind of 56 minor ethnic groups. So it is a kind of image that China will become stronger and become, expanding for its influence outside China's kind of traditional kind of influence of the fear. So that's the second reason. The third reason is that for example, if you were standing on the near side of the road, if there is a very huge car driving by with the kind of a high speed, you will feel threatened by nature or by kind of the emotion. So that's a natural that's a kind of a natural sense of the feeling China as a threat. But what we need to do is to try to explain to the outside world that China is getting stronger, will not expand, will not kind of become a hegemonial or hegemony like this kind of thing. So this is the logic and the value of the China threat. But I would like to say that the thesis of the China threat will exist for a longer period, because China is getting stronger and stronger. As long as China is getting stronger and stronger, this kind of thesis will exist. But we need to do some kind of job to explain to the outside world that China is not a threat.
It would be safe if everyone is in the car, right?
Yes.
So the speed won't matter.
Yes.
So Einar, help us understand more of what Professor Xia said, that in the West eyes, that China at first they would question, can you do it? And then you're collapsing. and now you're a threat. What's the logic behind that?
Well, it's very simple. I see it from an American point of view looking in, and that is, quite frankly, China's political and economic system is an existential threat to the United States idea that it has the perfect system. If you go back to Francis Fukuyama, we all know him. He's been backing away from this idea that the end of the world and the last man standing, this idea that liberal democratic capitalism is the be-all. There is no way to go forward. That's the end of mankind in terms of evolution in this area. Well, if you're an American exceptionalist, somebody who believes that the US needs to be in charge of the world in order to prevent World War III, in order to safeguard the international order, the rule of law, all of these things, China's success doesn't work for you. Why? Because it has a different system. Now, it could work if we could just simply say there are many paths that can lead to prosperity, and that different cultures, different systems will invariably have different answers and ways of addressing them. But we don't. So we continue down this thing that, originally it was, well, we'll get China to join the WTO, right, remember? And that was going to, if China embraces capitalism, democracy will come. In essence, it was the dream of regime change in China. They literally thought the government would collapse from within because people would, love capitalism. But China thrived. It used capitalism as a mechanism to extend its socialist values.
But is it all about ideological matter, ideological threat?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, underneath it, you have those who consciously push this idea. The war machine, the military-industrial complex, it's just us or them. They have a team mentality. We have to win. We need everything that, we need all the tools necessary to do it. Give us more money. But subconsciously, in America, there is this belief that we're number one. How many times have you gone anywhere and they say, we're number one, right? America first. That was a slogan that came in afterwards. But it was very much a reaction. China is saying the world is for everybody.
That's right.
Not America is first. So let us say that these visions are somewhat apart. Now, for China, it's purely mathematics. You cannot, everyone in the world can't be the US because you have less than 5% of the population consuming more than 20% of the world's GDP. You just do the simple math. It just doesn't work. And even if China was to achieve that, there would be nothing left for the rest of the world.
Okay, David, sorry. David.
The question you asked was, we know what needs to be done and why it's not happening. And I think the biggest single obstacle that the world faces at the moment in terms of building the global community we need is US hegemony. If you think about it in historical terms, Einar made the point about the US being number one. In historical terms, the US hasn't been number one for a very long time. But in human terms, there's next to nobody alive today who can remember a time when the US was not number one. And the US has a very deep need to hang on to that number one spot. The US is like an athlete, a runner, who's never lost a race. And they're obsessed with their status as always being the winner. And they now face a situation where it is certain that somebody else is going to overtake them. And they need to learn. It's having a visceral effect on that country. And they need to learn to cope with the idea that they do not have to be number one at everything all the time. Because if they don't do that, we're not going to make progress, we're not going to move forward. The things that we know need to happen are not going to be allowed to happen.
You should ask Americans if they agree with that.
That's American egoism.
Well, no, to take your point. Arrogance is the downfall of empires. And quite frankly, I agree with everything you just said. The problem is that what is happening in America is infectious. The poor leadership that leads to scapegoating, to looking to somebody else is at fault. It couldn't be us. Why should we reflect? It's not our fault. It's somebody else's fault. That has led in a chain reaction to poor leadership around the world. So it does matter. When you are a power, right? You have a responsibility. I mean, I'm so tired of people telling me about their rights. Where are the responsibilities? You cannot have one without the other. The US has no right to rule the world, but as the #1 power, it has a responsibility to do it well. And we're not, okay? We have, if you look up the definition of a rogue nation, we often label others as rogue. What do? Well, they start wars. They undermine the international institutions, right? They disregard the rights of others, right? They impose their will on others. This, in a nutshell, is the United States. We've been involved in 81% of all the conflicts since World War II. Well, you can say, oh, we're fighting the good fight, but it's not. Nothing has improved. We are less safe today than we were after World War II, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there needs to be self-reflection in the United States before anything can happen. Because if the US does not want to play, I do not know how you can bring the world together.
Well, exactly. In China, it's a quite long history and philosophy about to call the people with different background and culture background, living experiences, they united together. There's been a long history for that and for this kind of inclusiveness. So, Mr. Zhao, maybe we can discuss that from the perspective of history, and maybe we can start it from the perspective of modern international relationships about how does China ensure this kind of inclusiveness and ability to coexist with other cultures?
Well, actually, before we enter this question, I would like to clarify two very similar but kind of two difficult concept with difficult understanding. That is the civilization and the culture. In my opinion, actually, well, different scholars will have different agreement on the concept of the civilization and culture. In my opinion, culture is more of a it's more of a, let's say, a product and this kind of a real thing. But civilization is more broad, and civilization is more generous. Civilization can exist. We can have only one civilization, like a human civilization, the Earth civilization, the solar system civilization. However, within this kind of Earth civilization, we can have a different culture. For example, the Asian culture, the European culture, even African culture. So, in terms of this, actually, in ancient China, the emergence of Chinese civilization was kind of starting to incorporate the different cultures when the ancient China faced all these kind of different culture. For example, we know that the grape was not grown in China. Grape kind of imported from the Central Asia, right? And also the grain, nowadays we eat the grain. The grain does not exist in China for a longer period. And also we know some kind of instrument, the kind of erhu, the instrument, and traditional Chinese music. And all these kind of, even the clothing style, they were coming from the Central Asia and even different culture, different kind of, cultural background. So we can see that the entire, Chinese civilization history is the absorption and adaptation to different cultures into one single or one general or one integrated civilization. So this is how China can show to the outside world that it still has the level of inclusiveness and level of ability to coexist with other cultures, even to generate one single civilization.
Professor Zha, are you as optimistic to think that Chinese and the Western culture and values can communicate?
Yes and no. Let me say the no first. It does seem that there is that echo chamber, both here in China and in some countries, as you call the West, although that very notion is contested in an academic sense, partly due to the pandemic, partly due to, the distance of travel or the realities of time zone differences. The actual level of interactions at the societal level has been traditionally thin between China and those countries we generally call the West. And over the years, the power of prevailing narratives or simplifying narratives is strong. So we have to be aware of that. It's quite risky, actually. Now, can we get along? I think that there's the yes side. The yes side is that although earlier our discussions, commentators mentioned realization or self-recognition of the notion of exceptionalism. Mind you, there is a good deal of that in every society and every culture. And that very realization opens the window to, let's say, self-learning, self-reflection, and that self-reflection can lead to, if not change, moderations of what we usually call harsh views or attitudes. In the totality, I wouldn't view the rhetoric that paints China as a threat that alarmingly. I would treat this as an invitation to greater efforts to communicate and to understand, appraise, and appreciate, and most importantly, to self-reflect. That holds true for China. It also holds true for those who may be waving their fingers against whatever they define to be China.
There have been great deal of efforts in achieving that, in achieving inclusiveness, in achieving unity. Olympics, for one, is
a good example.
It's a good example, a great effort in doing that. And I was at the closing ceremony of the 2022 Beijing Olympics and Paralympic Games. I was the on-site announcer, and that's why, David, your tie seems very familiar to me.
Yes, I'm wearing with great pride my Winter Olympics tie. I was actually invited to the opening ceremony, but I also spoke on a couple of occasions to the staff organising.
About what?
Well, I spoke to them about international communication, and I was rewarded with a tie in exchange.
Right, talking about international communication, actually we noticed one more word was added to the original motto, stronger, faster and higher.
That's right.
Together.
It's a new one?
Yeah. It's a new one. It's an involvement. What do you think is the purpose of adding that one more word, together?
Well, interestingly enough, there's also the slogan, building a better future together.
Right.
And I actually participated in the discussion which led to that slogan being selected. There were a number of options, some English, some Chinglish, but I actually helped to devise the slogan. But what you were saying about young people, I think is really, really important in terms of the concept of a global community. Because young people are the future, and young people are a very important demographic. And one of the things that China has to learn to do is to engage with people on a human level. And they should specifically target young people, because apart from anything else, young people have not spent many years hearing negative stories about China. So they're more likely to be open and they're more likely to be positive. Now, what are young people interested in? They're interested in music, they're interested in fashion, and they're interested in cool sports like snowboarding. And what does China have now? They have a group of people, successful young people like Su Yiming and Gu Ailing, in a field that young people around the world are interested in. So I think that is a key area, that sport and events like the Winter Olympics is a key area where they can play a part in communicating positive messages about China to receptive audiences.
Now I want to turn to our online guest, Teshome. We're talking about as the Olympic Committee has been putting together into the motto. How do you see this kind of evolution and changes?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show, and the views I express are mine. I think the concept of building a community with shared future together is a very important concept because no one country, big or small, in China or USA, can shoulder the current challenge humanity is facing. That's why I think building a community with a shared future together is important. I want everyone to look at the concept, the merit of the concept and the content of the concept rather than the messenger. I think we should look at the message because in the last 10 years, we have faced so many challenges. And I believe that we are living in a very volatile, complex, and unstable world. And what we need to do together is to really have an inclusive process where we can address all these challenges. And that can only come if you have, I think, unity of purpose. That can only be a reality if we work together. Of course, it is not easy. It is easier than done, but we have no other choice, I believe, because the current type of the problem we are facing, including the pandemic we went through, required global cooperation. And the global community cannot be built only through competition. I believe that there should be competition, but at the same time, there should be cooperation and solidarity. And the concept of, I think, building a community with shared future clearly signifies the importance of solidarity and cooperation. That's how I look at it.
That's right. So, Joseph, are you with us? So what would be the
Yes.
consequences if nations or people of different communities are cutting apart rather than getting together? What is your point?
From the youth perspective, I think it's very problematic because when we look at the biggest picture, we see that now people are more connected. From the young perspective, working together is actually the future. Is actually everything for us. You mentioned a variety of topic a while ago, like going to the Winter Olympic and everything. All that were good news for us because we've been actually restrained for 2 to 3 years. So communication among people, I'm referring to down to earth communication, have been actually restrained ever since the pandemic broke out. So to resort to conflict or to resort to any kind of conflict of any sort is actually very problematic, and especially for me coming from Africa, where the population is extremely young. So I think throughout, just to link up with the main topic, which is the community, building up the community with a shared future. Throughout my experience here in China, I actually learned that since ancient time that some have mentioned, like Chinese always held a say going, all people under the heaven are one family, and all the people are brothers, and we share the life of all creatures. And this actually resonates with the African perception of community and life. We call that in Africa Ubuntu. So that's why we are very actually inclined, the young population, when I say we, I say the youth, is very inclined for partnership, cooperation, rather than conflict.
Indeed, such kind of education, especially into the younger group, the young people, is very important. Talking about the future, I'm very much into the sci-fi works recently, a big fan of Liu Seniority knew that. And the hit movie, the recently very hit movie, The Wandering Earth 2. By the way, who saw that? Raise your hand, please. Yes. Professor Xia saw that. For those who didn't see it, don't worry, no worries. We're going to give you some rough ideas of what the movie is about.
Lieutenant Colonel Liu Baocheng, please head to the hibernation chamber immediately.
Mouse, 人类能活下来吗？
2044, the space elevator crisis.
Oh my God.
2058, lunar fall crisis. 2075, the Jupiter gravitational pull crisis. 2078, the solar helium flash crisis. In order to survive, great efforts and sacrifices were made by men. Men are in awe of the history, yet despise the future. The fate of civilization is under the choices of men. The biggest impediment for survival is never weakness, but arrogance.
Okay, so Professor Xia, you raised your hand just now, meaning you've seen it, but I need to verify that. So a little quiz for you. What's the name of that AI robot that interviewed Liu Baocheng?
The name is Moss. The name
why
is
Moss?
Because it's a kind of the word upside down, because its type is 550W. So the words upside down is Moss. Okay. So that's the name of the AI.
So you already did see that.
Yeah.
Great, great, great. So what impressed you the most when you're watching a film about human beings facing the extreme kind of disaster together?
Well, actually, like you, I'm also a very kind of big fan of the sci-fi, and I have read all the works written by Mr. Liu Cixin from the Three-Body Problem and also this kind of Wandering Earth. And I have watched this the first episode of Wandering Earth 3 or 4 years ago, and then when this second kind of episode came out, I just went to the cinema for the first time. I mean, the first time it came out, and the most impressed kind of plot to me is that well, human society actually by nature by nature human society cannot join together, and they always want their kind of their own interest, their own kind of solution. For example, a certain country in the movie, they wanted to develop their own kind of technology to pursue their own interest. However, facing the general crisis to the human civilization, I mean the crisis to the civilization, to the earth, well, that kind of crisis, push the human society, the community for the share in the future join together. So just back to the previous kind of question, well, what is the consequence of people do not join together? Right. What is the kind of consequence of people setting apart? In my opinion, cutting apart is the natural sense, it's a natural situation. However, joining together is more difficult than remain this, the current situation. That is why we need to do something. Is it possible
that joining together will create more conflicts?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Joining together will definitely create some kind of a disagreement, but that disagreement not necessarily, develop into conflict because people have the wisdom to solve the agreement.
Because that's not the aim.
Yeah. So one of the, impressive kind of plot in the movie is that a China diplomat standing in the United Nations and the platform and made a speech to all the people, to all the human civilization, saying that, in ancient time, an ancient kind of the prehistory people, he got broken in his leg, and all his kind of, not necessarily neighbors, but also their kind of, not necessarily friends, but also neighbors, just came to help him, got his leg healed. Why cannot we, in the modern time, in the 21st century, people join together to solve our kind of crisis? So that's kind of touched me a lot.
And you know what, Dongning, the crisis doesn't exist only in sci-fi movies. Because over the past decades, particularly the past few years, we've seen a number of global crises, and many of which have required the joint efforts of many countries.
The world is still battling multiple crises that threaten peace and stability. According to the World Food Program, around 345 million people will not have enough food in 2023. More than 900,000 people are fighting to survive in famine conditions. The organization says 70% of those affected are living in conflict zones like Yemen, Ukraine, and the Tigray region. The conflicts also fuel inflation and skyrocketing energy prices. The International Energy Agency in 2022 warned that over 75 million people worldwide will not be able to afford electricity. As central banks hike interest rates in response to inflation, the World Bank warns the world may be edging toward a global recession in 2023. It has slashed the global economic growth outlook to 1.7% this year, down from 3%. It has also predicted the global core inflation rate to stand at about 5% this year, nearly double the 5-year average before the pandemic. Meanwhile, critical public health emergencies are also dominating headlines. As of March, more than 6 million people have lost their lives. Other major public health issues, such as Ebola and monkeypox, continue to raise international concerns.
As now we turn to Professor Zha. So why are we seeing such global crisis now? And do you think the conflicts are intensifying during the past decade?
So conflicts are not really bad. It's how you meaning any actor, react to a conflict. But your question has a serious dimension to that. That is to say, for a while, especially with quote unquote lessons of forever wars, the U.S. was involved in Afghanistan and in Iraq and wherever else. Now, for a while, a couple of years, there was a sense of relief, both in NATO countries and outside NATO, saying, oh, well, solutions does not have to be the ultimate. But unfortunately, I'm not saying, I'm not attributing any kind of causal relationship. The military means have now seems to be a renewed option. And you look at one government after another massively increasing their military budgets. Let's face it, this money can be spent, there is a choice of how you spend the money. But when you produce bullets, bullets don't go away as chocolate bars go. So it's more concerning. Now, I would think there can be zillions of interpretations or point of analysis that say, that try to make sense of the growing trend towards, once again, choosing war as a means of resolving conflicts. But then collectively, I mean, for the countries, especially in this outside of NATO, we need to be saying more loudly, telling them, look, have you really exhausted all means of conflict resolution? And that's, we shouldn't be hijacked by that sentiment, saying the West, so-called West, my English is always bad. If you recall, a couple of years back at the Munich Security Conference, the Munich Security Conference is not just a conference. It's a place that shapes the agenda of military policies, mainly NATO countries. One justification for that was the so-called Westlessness. In other words, somehow the West was absent in managing affairs worldwide. Now, outside NATO, outside the countries that the NATO workshops like the Munich Security Conference, we should be, I would go even further, saying educating those who believe somehow that Westfulness would mean happiness for all. We have to be careful here. I hope this is not going to be viewed by our audiences as should we say, a thrust of a challenge or a confrontation, but I do believe there is space for more open-mindedness, both in the so-called West and outside, more particularly NATO.
And Teshome, what is your takes on those global crises in the recent decade?
If you take the relationship between China and Africa, for instance, the Chinese government and the Chinese people have chosen their own governance model, their own development model. It worked for them, and China now has become one of the major global powers, economically, technologically, militarily. But one thing that created a conducive space for us to work with China is China has never imposed any of its will, any of its policies on Africa. I think that is how we should go about. Otherwise, imposition and then putting pressure on countries to choose the values of other societies has created and complicated the problem for global governance coming together. Now, in terms of the way forward, again, I still believe that we need to put the multilateral system into effectiveness. We need to strengthen the system. We all need to work together so that the process should be inclusive. We had just the AU summit here in Addis Ababa, and one call that all leaders have made that Africa should have a place at UN Permanent Security Council because a continent with 54 member states, a continent with 1.3 billion people, and a continent whose agenda has always been tabled. Most of the table at the UN Security Council does not have representatives. How can we really work together as humanity so that we can all participate, we can all contribute? Now, The Chinese wisdom, again, is extremely important. The last 4 years, what I observed when I was Ethiopia's ambassador to China is that China is willing to share whatever it has, whether it is a development model, whether it is technology transfer, whether it is other Chinese experience on the wheel of the receiving countries, on the wheel of the continent of Africa, where we worked as partners. This is very critical, and I think we have to have an open line of dialogue. We have differences, there is no question about that. And we are not envisaging a world without difference. But how do we manage our differences? Through respect to one another, through dialogue, through communication, avoid and stop imposition or of your own wish on others. I think those are very fundamental principles that we can live as humanity. And then certainly we have a future to share, not only for us, but for our children, for the coming generation. And we have a responsibility to work together.
Right. And Professor Zha just said the conflicts are not necessarily completely negative. And I think crises are not necessarily completely negative either, because especially Chinese believe there are always opportunities in crisis. That's why we always say 危机,
That's right.
opportunities in crisis. But one of the gigantic common crisis we're facing right now, Professor Liu, is the climate change issue, the climate issues. And that's actually an opportunity at the same time that can bring all countries sitting down at the same table to talk about it, right? Peacefully, maybe not very peacefully, because there are gigantic differences on this matter as well. So are you optimistic to see that problem being solved?
Well, as a researcher in philosophy and ethics, I would say, okay, human beings are really the young species on this very small planet.
Yes.
And they are born as community animals, so therefore they need to hug together and work hand in hand. And in the same time, they need to learn faster, to be more creative in order to survive, because individually they are more vulnerable than monkeys, than polar bears. And so that really set the notion of togetherness, as we have discussed. But in the meantime, human beings are more greedy than any other animals, because they always wanted to possess more. But that's really the motive, to move forward the civilization. If
some would say it's for human being survival. How would you answer that?
If we are able to have a rule-based framework, so that nobody is there to predate on the other's interest in terms of the territory, in terms of the material wealth, and also human dignity. And now you talk about the crisis, and I would say that the biggest crisis is not really climate change, is not really about the pandemic, but also the human greed that is unchecked. And that is the permanent, hideous disease that the human beings really need to carry. So to solve the problem, we are able to make sure that people are able to compete, because people wanted to stand out and to possess more on a fair basis. But on the other hand, we also need to cultivate the people's conscience through self-discipline. And for that, the Xi Jinping's concept of a shared future is there, derived from the long historical philosophy and also ethical values that are there working for China, and hopefully it's going to be working for the entire mankind, because this concept begins with individual conscience cultivation, and also with family discipline, and then with state governance, and with world pacification. Right. And that really allows inclusivity in which universal values are there to be applied for all human beings with respect, and also particular attention needs to be paid to differences of the social, political, and cultural backgrounds. So that's something that can be promoted. But the issue is that this concept is really there to be highly valuable, but we need to strategize it into a more of the global lexicon in which that people from different cultural, different social background can really interpret it in the right direction instead of it being misused and abused.
Right, you raised a very big, very philosophical question, how to contain human greed. Human greed actually in one aspect can promote the development of the human race, but on the other hand, it needs to be contained. And
yes, I think civilization really moved forward by people standing on the shoulder of the other with vision and wisdom, but not really standing on the bodies of the other,
right.
To be able to move.
We are not only standing on the bodies of other races, but on our own race as well.
Exactly.
That's something that we need to contain, as well as relentless actions of emitting carbon dioxide. And some people have been making great efforts in registering very accurate carbon footprints. I know you made a fantastic documentary about that.
Do you know that every day our species consumes more than 1.5 million terajoules of energy? 84% of those energy comes from fossil fuels.
Presently, we are emitting about 40 gigatons per year of CO2.
And you know the rest of the story.
We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
My colleagues and I embark a global journey.
It's failed!
It's almost like launching a rocket.
Solar panels could be found anywhere in China.
To find solutions to erase the carbon footprint of humans from this planet. They could be large or small. Concrete or virtual. Some old-fashioned ones.
It's like science fiction.
With a bit imagination. At the ends of the earth, or just under your feet. We must reduce carbon emission on the one hand, and remove those in the atmosphere on the other. Complementary efforts to help us reach net zero emissions. You ready?
That's right. It's called Human Carbon Footprint. And, well, I didn't expect that would be the guest today. I thought I'm the host. So thanks for having me. Well, that's
You're welcome.
Well, that's a phenomenal journey to make the films like that, because this film is talking about a very buzzword last year about carbon neutrality. It was the big words, popular, so popular that everybody was talking about it. If you ask persons on the street, have you ever heard of carbon neutrality? Well, in Chinese, it's 碳中和. Have you ever heard about that? People would say, well, yeah, we heard about this.
And with specific numbers as well.
That's right. But people have been confused about this term because when we're talking about carbon neutrality, we're talking about net zero emissions. But many people thought, okay, that means a zero emission. They would confuse these two terms of people about, well, maybe we should get rid of the fossil fuels completely and emitted nothing at all. But in the near future, it's impossible. Maybe in the future, it will become possible when we successfully control the fusion, which we'll talk about that later. But in the near future, we still need to use the fossil fuels. But the question would become how we can reduce the use of this carbon emission. In the international community, we've been talking too much about is funding and technology transfer because we have to rely on science and innovation. So I got this a question for Mr. Zha. So what is your take on how we can reach the carbon neutrality? And we've been talking too much about funding issues and technology transfer issues on the international community. But why this becomes the biggest obstacles on the way to deal with the climate change crisis?
Climate change has many dimensions to that. What you have just mentioned summarizes more of the recognitions by scientists and those who campaign on behalf of protecting the global environment. But in the context of the COP27 that was conducted in Egypt November last year, the issue of funding became more formal. Well, that issue of funding has been there for a while. Now, many in the quote-unquote global south, meaning more developing countries, are now seeing greater light that they would get funding support to address climate change challenges in their own societies. That may not be coming that easily because that funding may comes through the channel of development aid, and with aid you always have many of the projects will be tied to interests and conditions that are set by what we may call the global north. So at the end of the day, there is indeed an issue that's sometimes not addressed. That would be what's called climate justice. In other words, countries, especially those in the low and middle income sectors, the low and middle echelons of global development, they can and they have the right to demand more climate justice treatment. But on the other hand, they don't really have a shortcut. There are opportunities here, and that opportunities, how those opportunities should be marketized. In other words, how those opportunities should become a new venue for transnational companies to profit from. That's a real question to address. But at the same time, all low and middle income countries will need to make a more strenuous effort to climb up the ladder of technology, to streamline institutional support domestically so that their societies generate some endogenous, let's say, impetus to reduce carbon emissions in their own societies.
Well, thanks for your insight, Mr. Zha. To reach the carbon neutrality, switching to clean sources of energy also helps to address climate change. And 35 nations have collaborated on an experiment by the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, or ITER. It is an international nuclear fusion research project aimed at creating energy. For this discussion, we're joined online by Mr. Luo Delong, Director General of China International Nuclear Fusion Energy Program Execution Center. So welcome to our show, Mr. Luo. So how about we start with this section with a brief introduction about ITER. What is ITER and what is the goal of this project?
Thank you. ITER is International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. It's a mega science engineering project trying to produce power or generation power, use the same kind of theory as the sun. So currently it's composed of 7 members, namely China, Europe, India, Japan, Korea, Russia, and the United States. Altogether, we have 7 members, but Europe itself, we have 28 members, so there are around 34 countries all together in this project. We are trying to produce a thermonuclear fusion reactor to explore the possibility to use fusion to generate power, which is similar to how the sun is making power.
You notice that in China and in many other countries that they also have their fusion facilities, but why does ITER need global scientific support, or how important is this global cooperation to this project?
You know, to produce something like the sun on the Earth is really a miracle. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, it's very, very difficult. We need very complex facilities to trying to achieve this. So to do this, we need to share the knowledge of the world. We need to share the cost of the big, very expensive project, and we need to share the risk, because it's a difficult project. We don't really know the final goal is achieved. Of course, we have confidence, but still we need to share the risk. So all this is really the need for international collaboration. And for this project, all the members are bearing the same objective and trying to address the common goal, which is to address the international issues, to solve the energy need. I mean, to meet the energy need of the humankind. So by this, we come together and to trying to make this project.
So what does this ITER and nuclear fusion technology mean for the future of the mankind? Does that mean we can get rid of the fossil fuels completely?
Yes, but not very soon, because it's really very difficult. So far, we're still at the stage of experiments, and by the time we will trying to address all the scientific issues, technology issues, but still we need time to make commercial use of it. And if we can succeed, really we can solve all the needs of energy of the humankind in the long run. Currently, we are believing in the middle of this century, we can make it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lu, for all of your introduction about ITER.
This is a really cool job. So another focus of international collaboration is biodiversity. That's something I really want to address today, biodiversity conservation. And I'm very glad to see that some sort of agreement was reached at COP15 last year to protect 30% of the planet in general, and also put 30% of degraded ecosystems into protection as well. This by the year 2030. So David, it might be more difficult working to achieve biodiversity conservation balance than working in the ITER to get energy from the sun or the moon.
Yeah, you have a couple of different factors at play. You have an environment, and you have a thing called the ecology, and the ecology is the interaction of organisms within an environment. You need a healthy ecology to protect the environment, and you need a healthy environment to protect the ecology. One of the critical elements of ecology is biodiversity. People tend to think of scientists as noble, dispassionate people, disinterested people who are above human interests, and really that's not true. Scientists are human beings like the rest of us, and they're just as subject to fads and fashions. A huge amount of attention is currently being given to global warming, to climate change. But within the biodiversity issue, there's one specific problem, and it's insect die-off. There has been a massive decline in insect populations, and it's already happening. Insects are critical to biodiversity, they're critical to the existence of vegetation, they are critical to the food chain because they're right at the bottom of the food chain. And it's not getting enough attention. Now, it's something that needs to be addressed as part of the global community of shared future because it's worldwide. It's affecting developed countries, it's affecting virgin jungle. Why am I talking about that in this specific forum? Because China needs to take the lead. China creates more scientists in relative terms than anywhere else in the world. And given the scale, that means in absolute terms, China is creating a far greater number of scientists. Chinese culture is a more rational culture than Western culture. So I would hope that this is a particular problem that China will pick up on and China will address, because frankly, if this problem, which is already here, is not addressed, we can actually stop worrying about how hot it's going to be in 2050, because there isn't going to be anybody left to be hot. So from a biodiversity point of view, from a global community point of view, there are important things that can only be addressed globally and must be addressed as a matter of priority.
Right. Mando, what's your point on biodiversity conservation, especially in a continent of Africa? What more efforts and help do you think Africa needs in terms of that?
Okay, I totally agree with the last guest, because biodiversity is essential for, we know, the processes that support all life on Earth, including us, human. And they are actually, also, we have to mention, it is true for Africa or for anywhere else. There are some areas that are actually neglected, as I totally agree with the last guest. We have, for example, pollinators, like such as bird or bees, or the last guest mentioned the insects that are actually estimated to be responsible for a third of the world's crop production. So without those actually pollinators, we would not, for example, have apples or cherries or blueberries and many other things to we eat. So we depend on the services ecosystem provide, like fresh water, soil fertility and stability, and food and medicine. If I'm referring to Africa, for example, I would take the case of Kenya's Lake Turkana. It is one of the world, if not the world's largest desert lake, and it has a habitat for, it is a habitat for a variety of wildlife, including birds, Nile crocodile, and hippopotamus, and it is a source of food and income for about 300,000 people. But the lake is under heavy pressure because of overfishing, because of the drought, and also changing rainfall patterns, and the diversion of water by the upstream development. And these changes are leading to loss of biodiversity and the decline of fishery, etc. So without conservation method in place, this could be the fate of many more ecosystems. So I totally agree that if we can have such points to the attention of the international community, it will be very interesting, especially considering the fact that the African continent is very special in the fact that it produces less than 4% of the CO2 emission. We talked about CO2 gas emission like last time. So we are facing kind of climate injustice in Africa. So if it could be brought to the attention of the international community, and Africans as African leaders kept putting to the table, if African can also have more seats when it comes to the UN Security Council or relevant platform, that will be helpful. But overall, it's still a task that can be completed together, like hand in hand. It is becoming a global issue.
Well, I think we all understand the significance of protecting biodiversity as well as protecting our climate and environment. Everybody knows that.
It's a universal idea.
The problem is the solution.
Right,
and
action.
We've been covering the COP15, we've been covering COP27. No matter if it's for biodiversity or climate change, we understand this. The biggest challenges is about solution, and people has been fighting for this. Well, I think the biggest challenge and obstacle is still about sharing. They need to share about funding. They need to share about this technology. The developing countries asking the developed countries to transfer their technology, to transfer this fund, and also on the COP15, we realized that this COP15 requires all of the parties to share the information, like the digital information about genetic information, and they want to share this because some of the certain genetic code of some certain plants can produce billions of dollars each year for the pharmaceutical companies, and those information are coming from the developing countries, but the profits stay in the developed countries and those big companies, and that's the big issue. So Mr. Liu Baocheng, I want to hear about your takes on that.
Yes, I think the awareness is already there, from the upper class to the bottom line, but skills are not really there to match what is really required for the ecological protection. So therefore, to build the right type of training system and so that technology can be dispersed and skills can be enhanced to address the local and also critical issues that are there to challenge the environment is something that is highly realistic and also cost effective. And the other is that there needs to be a very fine balance in terms of expectation to address such climate change, because people do need to balance their economic growth versus the environmental quality. You can't, ask people to starve for months before they can really, have a good environment. So therefore, so that's something that that needs to be a more rule-based and consensus-based, operational program. So the common but differentiated responsibility needs to be further delivered in terms of the shared responsibility versus the climate change. And then also that the world need to work together to really to restructure the economic pattern in which China is really playing a pivotal role. So the world begin to blame China as the biggest carbon emitter, but China is operating the world factories. No, Americans are really they're willing to make shoes, doing those garments and even making TVs, or Europeans are the same. Actually, we export more than 90% of our solar panels to Europe, to North America. So therefore, when China is really supporting a cleaner environment and higher level of lifestyle, and so China needs to be sympathized and also supported in its entire program towards the carbon neutralization and carbon peaking program, instead of finger pointing on China. Companies needs to really to enhance the corporate social responsibility program so that they are not there to forsake the ecological benefit in order to achieve more of the stockholders' individual interest. And on the other hand, we also need another CSR, which is the social citizenship responsibility, in which that everyone will be there to be respected and also pay the right responsibility in terms of consumerism and also in terms of their the care about the earth in individual life and also in their communal life.
Right, we've actually seen some sharing, like sharing information, like vaccine distribution, like a COVAX in the pandemic. COVID-19 actually is a common crisis, maybe less than the helium and flash, but more or less the same. So in terms of dealing the pandemic, Einar, how would you reflect the global effort on that?
I give about a D-.
D-?
Yes. I mean, China was castigated for doing probably what, in 6 months from now, you're going to be able to look at excess deaths over a 3.5-year period. And you're going to be look at the economies. And you're going to see something very simple. China did very well. Another existential threat for countries that didn't do well, whose leadership was basically out to lunch, more interested in populism than actually the welfare of their constituents. So right now we have this situation where hundreds of billion, over $100 billion was found to prosecute a war, a conflict in Ukraine. Yet 50 billion was out of reach. That would have been a game changer if you had inoculated everybody at the very beginning. Trillions of dollars in lost economic activity would have been saved. Millions of lives would have been saved. Yet, I don't agree that we're rational. I'm sorry. I don't. I mean, it is irrational. We had the rational option. And what happened? You saw people playing politics. Now, I just wanted to add a couple of things. One, shared values does not mean, all right, as far as I understand, homogenized values. China is not trying to get the rest of the world to adopt Confucianism. And I think that has to be made very clear. What they're saying is that we have basic values, human values, that we should share and cherish. And we should work on that basis. In terms of conflict, there's always going to be conflict. The last 5,000 years of recorded history have shown us that human beings haven't changed. The enemy is the person we see in the mirror. It's our better natures versus our worse natures. When you talk about greed, I automatically thought of Exxon. In the 1970s, they knew global warming was there. They had confirmed it. All their scientists were saying it. Well, not all. I'm sure there's one who was willing to say no. But they buried the reports and went forward. Why? Because it was good for them. You know, one of the elephants in the room we haven't discussed is population. Population is expected to increase by 50%, over 12 billion before, quote, it tapers off, quote, naturally. I don't understand how that's going to happen naturally. I mean, right now, we are having tremendous problems with everything that you have been thinking. And what is the root cause? Overpressure due to population explosion. Why do I talk about it in terms of greed? Because of the classical idea economically that rising populations lead to bigger business, more profits, right? But it's killing us and our inability to do that. I'm not saying that we will act rationally, but I'm saying that shared values to me is about our better nature trying to put our worse nature in check.
What are your thoughts, Joseph?
Well, I totally agree. And it totally resonates with Africa as well. When we talk about vaccine distribution, you will see that there are a lot of, I would say, asymmetries, because Africa as a whole, or African countries as a whole, haven't yet received actually a greater percentage of a vaccine. When I say Africa, I say African people. And for me, I still keep a lot of expectations, because if we are to rate now what is happening now, I think it is still a lot questionable, especially when it comes to the fact that we haven't yet learned, from our past, from whatever happened in the past. And I refer to, for example, if we take the Africa case, the Ebola crisis, the HIV case, and the yellow fever, all those, we've been through all those, I would say, crisis. And when it comes to the Africa, we also had problems with vaccine distribution. And now here we go again with a new crisis, COVID-19. And so I still, I go with the last guest, sharing, but less also, because everything is already profitable. So, human-centered, that's why Africa, in many African countries, resonates with China, people-centered philosophy when it comes to these health issues. Yeah, so basically that's it. But I wish that we can really learn from. We can have a solidified, I would say, not even method, or we can have a solidified mindset within this COVID crisis to prepare further or later on crisis, because this unfortunately won't be the last crisis.
Well, thanks, Joseph. I think after pandemic, restoring our economy would be the mission number one, but unfortunately this is not an easy job, because we have to solve this untamable inflation around the world. Major economies are handling the inflation in different ways, which also have global impacts. So, Mr. Liu, there's any way to curb the inflation? Any solutions to that?
Well, inflation was really caused by the overdosage in the dealing with the pandemic. So that's one of the reason. And because simply you print more money and flood the market, and the goods are there not really matched. So this round of inflation is really caused from the supply side, in which much of the physical and the political obstruction over the free movement of goods in logistic management, and also in the huge tariff that is being imposed that make things are really difficult. In the end, the consumers are there to pay the price. So right now, simply by tightening the interest rate, can really bring the inflation down, as what is being handled in the United States and in the European countries. But in the meantime, you're going to stifle the vitality of the economy in which people are not there willing to invest and to borrow more money, and consumers are really tightening their purse and not to spend. So the real solution lies in one, of course, still global cooperation instead of begging the neighbor. Particularly now, the United States needs to take the right type of responsibility, because not only the SWIFT system, but also the dominance of the U.S. dollar. So when they really add water into their money, the whole value of the other currencies can be diluted, and then the G20 needs a better coordination, particularly in terms of financial policy, and also how we can really streamline those barriers in terms of the supply of food, energy, and the daily utilities on a more cost-effective way, and eliminate those the political rhetorics that are there to really deprive people of their basic assets. So that's something that needs to be quickly done, and that's the more of the strategic solution than a quick fix way, simply by raising interest rates.
Professor Xia, but should we see more international, global collaboration in terms of curbing inflation? We're not seeing quite much right now.
Yes, of course. And just now we've talked about a lot of global crises and different crises. Actually, we can have a basic categorization of all these kind of crises. When we talk about crisis, it means that something goes wrong or something is wrong, right? So basically, I have a three dimension to help us to understand where does this crisis come from. So first is the fundamental or foundation basis. And the second is the leadership or organization or institution or regulation. And the third one is the governance or issue or agenda or basic policy. So we can say that if we can get clear about why, what kind of a crisis is, or what kind of problem is, we can have a very particular solution. For example, the economic recovery or recovery of the global economy. In my opinion, it does not necessarily mean the international economic order is wrong. Actually, it is about the people's governance, or some kind of the politician or statesman's kind of the personal choice goes wrong or went wrong, causes this kind of difficulty of recovery of a global economy. And that means, well, someone, intentionally raise some kind of a barrier among people or among communities or among cultures. So next, stage, if we want to recover or make the recovery of global economy together or sooner, we need to, do some kind of a joint effort to reconnect people, to reconnect all these kind of lines, and make this world become more and more open and more connected with each other. Yeah.
But before that, we still have lots of challenges to deal with. We're also witness to global challenges that threaten food security in the Black Sea last year. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres commented on the crisis, saying, quote, "Ending hunger is within our reach. There is enough food in our world now for everyone if we act together." So, gentlemen, if we have this capability to produce enough food, why we are still seeing so many people are suffering from hunger? Maybe we can start from...
Well, look, there's a lot of things. First off, you had a major disruption. When Russia and Ukraine went into conflict, that just completely threw open, changes in the way that food, first off, availability. Second, the rerouting food to the extent it could be. The last part is fertilizers. And this is something there's going to be a delayed reaction. In Europe, it is expected, regardless of climate change and heating up and things like that, that you're going to have between 5 and 15% less yield because they didn't get the fertilizer they need. And those are other issues. So this coming year, it's going to be tough because they just didn't get it. So yes, we can produce enough food, but getting it to the people is another thing. In India, they produce tons of food. And guess what? A huge percentage of it rots because they cannot get the food to the market.
That's right.
All right? They don't have the infrastructure. China has said repeatedly, well, to get rich, to do well, build a road. And this is true. It's a very basic idea. It's not something that should be controversial. It is not about creating debt diplomacy. It is simply about allowing people, all right, to have a fairly decent life. But unfortunately, politics over and over again, greed, special interests. I mean, they're not going to allow this. And if you talk to them, I know some of these people, these captains of industries, I said, you know, come on, really? Is this what your thing's GMO is you can make billions of dollars off the backs of people who can barely feed themselves? You don't allow them, they have to buy the seed from you, you control them. Isn't this a security risk for them? Isn't there a possibility of disease breaking out and doing that? Well, you know, that's just, you know, look, we can't change the industry. Our competitors are out there, if we don't do it, they will. This attitude is what really hurts humanity.
So I just sort of keep nodding his head when listening to Einar's answers. So what's your thought on this matter?
Definitely, I totally agree. Especially, you know, I can relate that from the you know, African continent, because conflict is actually keep remaining or remains the number one key driver of acute food insecurity. But we can produce a lot. You know, we all know that in Africa, you know, conditions, all the conditions are, you know, made to produce actually food for, we are now 1.3 billion, you know. So security, if we look at the numbers, we'll see that more than 70% of people experiencing hunger live in areas afflicted by war and violences. And then we also have the economic shock, right? We had a total of, for example, 30.2 million people in, you know, in various African countries, which actually were in crisis, and worst level of acute food poverty were actually noted from 2021 to 2022, and, you know, reflecting actually food prices, soaring food prices due to global economic recovery from COVID-19, we have to say that, and high inflation that was mentioned a while ago. But also, I think another fact is linked to climate change. You know, it causes also global hunger, you know, and more frequent and intense extreme weather events. We have over 80% of the world's hungry people who live in disaster-prone countries. And you might have heard what happened to the East African, you know, historical drought. So these are also some of the key factors which might explain why we can produce food, yes, but still we're facing a food crisis. You know, we see from last year African Union, you know, big theme like food security, you know, was the big theme of the African Union. So those are, you know, it speaks a lot. It's actually trying to raise awareness. So yeah, I think when it comes to the African case, and I think for the whole world in general, those are, I think, in my sense, the main factors why we're still producing. We're producing a lot of food, but still facing some food insecurities.
David, what's your thought on this?
And it comes down to the fact that we've looked at a lot of different aspects today. The global political environment has impacts, and has impacts on things that look small, like fertilizers. Fertilizers doesn't look like a huge thing. And then all of a sudden, you realize that the actions that we take have international repercussions again. The ripples spread out from what is apparently a small thing and affects the whole world. And we've talked about a number of different aspects today. We've looked at health, we've looked at environment, we've looked at energy use, and everything that we look at, it becomes more and more apparent that we face challenges that can only be addressed on a global level. So just to tie that back to the theme of this forum, this conversation, the global community of shared future, it becomes obvious. The more in detail you drill down, the more you see that things have an international impact. And we must learn to work together. We must learn to build that global community out of disparate countries with disparate values and disparate systems.
And Professor Liu.
Yeah, I think there are three keywords, three A's. One is availability, second is accessibility, third is affordability. Availability is not really a big issue because we really have abundant supply of food. But accessibility is now being disrupted because of the original conflict and also because of the high rise of the shipping cost, etc. And then also many of those countries who really suffer from hunger, they are also suffering from debt distress. So how the world really can really help them, first to deal with the contingency issue, and then also to help them to really aid on two very important issues. One is really there to develop the right type of infrastructure, because as my student from Kenya says, during the dry season, he would really tuck below the belly of the cow to avoid the rays of the sun. And during the rainy season, they would go to the mountains. So they do not really there to build the right type of reservoir to really to regulate or compensate the seasonal changes. So the infrastructure needs to be there to be supported and developed. And the other is that how locally they can really grow their more of their own crops, and by storage, by processing, by preserving those food. And then, so this is something that they also need certain help. And the other is that when we talk about the China aiding program, the global aiding program, we talk about, well, give them fish or give them fishing. But in addition, giving them fishing skills, and we need also to offer them the fish market. Mm-hmm. So therefore, China has really, over the past the 7 years, actually we offer zero tariff for all the materials, all the fruits that are made by those least developed countries to be imported into China. And this is really an over-delivery to our commitment to WTO, and China is doing that. And so China is really setting a good example for more of those developed world to really to match the China's efforts. So, with all these, 3 A's, there should be a sort of solution in which, instead of, giving them far-fetched ideas, liberal democracy, all the big documents, or the Vision 2063. So that's too far. Give them something that's very real.
And when we talked about a food crisis, we actually not only talked about agriculture and food production, we were talking about so much more than that behind, right? So, Mr. Xia.
Yeah, I totally agree with the previous gentleman's idea. And besides, like I mentioned before, the food security particularly means that the crisis of the food does not necessarily mean we don't have, as a human being, we don't have the ability. We have the ability, right? So it is not about the fundamental, it is about the institution. So there are too much kind of concentration about the production, but too much fragmentation about this kind of distribution. So in my opinion, empower the UN, empower this kind of a global governing system so that everyone can share this kind of food and whatever interest.
But before we go, I'd like to take a little time from you gentlemen to answer one of my own questions, the long-lasting questions. We've talked about a lot of issues have been addressed. People are fully aware what dangers and threats we are facing as human beings on this planet, our home sweet home. But we rarely see some real actions or even action plans. We've seen withdrawal even from the already signed pact or already signed agreement. Why is that happening? Why no actions? Professor Liu.
That is the importance of China's notion of shared future. So that can be further disseminated, understood, and also being strategized for operational purposes. So the second is the United Nations organizations, as my friend has been talking about. They need to play a more responsible role. I shouldn't say a sufficient role, a more responsible role to really to defend the justice, to defend adequacy in the provision of the people's basic need, because as we said, that many of those materials, energy, food, they are there. So we just need to streamline the right type of rules to reduce the artificial barriers that block those accessibility. And then also that people need to be further educated in order to have the right type of capacity. So when I was really making a lecture in the African continent, I said, okay, do not just sit under the tree and wait for the papaya to drop, but simply get rid of those victim mentality and roll up your sleeves and work. And then also the infrastructure development is something that connect people, connect more of the factors of production. And so China is really setting a good example, and people are really to benefit. So therefore, the best practices can also be dispersed around the world. And then the Western world need really to look at a basic reality. The world order is really on a rapid change, and the comfort by imposing stereotype onto other nations will be the already past history. So therefore, respect the self-determination, and also respect the individual cultural traits by working together, so we are able to find more solutions than problems the humans are really facing.
All right, thank you, gentlemen, for your brilliant ideas and opinions, both online and in the studio. We gained a thorough and precise understanding of the concept of building community with a shared future for mankind today.
Well, despite this is a Chinese concept, there is hope that it could be adopted by all civilizations across the world, and because its inclusiveness indicates peace and development for each and every one of us.
Indeed, and as globalization brings nations together closer than ever, and with multiple global crises emerging that impacts us all, different countries should be more open-minded to listen to others' appeals, and the human race needs to decide, and more importantly, act as a community. We may not be able to reach too far into the vast universe just yet, but I believe the universal idea of turning our planet into a peaceful and united place is definitely reachable.
And a reminder, CGTN will present 2 other forums on how to safeguard world security and how to promote shared development. I'm Yang Zhao in Beijing, and thanks for watching.
And I'm Li Dongning. Please stay tuned with CGTN.
Bye for now.
各国相互联系、相互依存的程度空前的加深，人类生活在同一地球村里，生活在历史和现实交汇的同一时空里，越来越成为你中有我，我中有你的命运共同体。
作为全球治理的一个重要领域，应对气候变化的全球努力是一面镜子，给我们思考和探索未来全球治理模式。 推动建设人类命运共同体带来宝贵启示，
让和平的薪火代代相传，让发展的动力源源不断，让文明的光芒熠熠生辉，是各国人民的期待，也是我们这一代政治家应有的担当。 中国方案是构建人类命运共同体，实现共赢共享。
世界又一次站在历史的十字路口，何去何从，取决于各国人民的抉择。中国始终坚持维护世界和平、促进共同发展的外交政策宗旨。 致力于推动构建人类命运共同体。